Good morning. We are in Beis, volume 2, middle of page 1176. A third of the way down. We're talking about Daas. Ostensibly, Daas, because he's explained Daas Ayin and Daas Tachten in Avodah, in the Odom, as he put it, that just like there are two perspectives in Alakus, in godliness. One is Das Elyon, the higher perspective, and one is the lower perspective. In other words, godliness itself, godly energy has both dimensions. So too, the human being has to have these two dimensions. And he calls that Yichud Ilah and Yichud Tata. To explain the Yichud of Havaya and Elikim, two levels in that Yichud, which we shall learn about a little later. To understand that, he went into what Das is. Because Das Ayin, using the word Das, you're not calling it Chachma Elyena and Chachma Tachtena. You're not calling it Bina Elyena and Bina Tachtena. You're calling Das Ayin, Das Tacht. Additionally, I should say, which we'll see a little later, remember I mentioned that this whole section in Ayin Beis is an explanation of the verse, V'yadaita hayim, v'ashavesa levavecha ki Hashem elikim v'shamayim emal v'al ha'oretz mitochas ein eid. That theme began to be discussed. I'll share it with you in the Shavuos Maimer, just to point it out. So the verse there says v'yadaita, which we're going to learn now about the word yadaita. It could have been other use. The word v'yadaita refers to specifically Das. So I believe that's also part of the reason the Rabbi Rashab is explaining what Das is, because it all comes back to that v'yadaita. That subject began, let me see here. I believe, where was it? The Bira Inyan. Yeah. Page Taf Kuf Tzadik Vav, 996. The Rabbi Rashab began v'yadaita hayim, which began the whole discussion about hayim, yom and laila, rotzi v'shuv, Shabbos, and the weekdays, das Elyon and das Tachten. So it's all part of that discussion as well. Just wanted to put it in that context. So 996 is where it began v'yadaita hayim. Okay. Now, going back to what we learned yesterday, so we established like this, that in contrast to Chachma and Bina, which is Yediyah and Hasaga, knowing and understanding, Das is not just knowing and understanding, it's connecting, attachment, Hiskashrus and Hischabrus. And he said, Oy Hiskashrus of Chachma and Bina, or from Moichin to Midas. But it's also obviously the Hiskashrus of the person to the idea. Because Adam Yoda means Adam Yoda's Chavaz is a Hiskashrus, a connection, a bond between the two of them. So that's a given. But in addition, he also said the Chachma Bina Meichin Midas. He said, nevertheless, Das isn't just a bond. Das is also a moyach. It's also a stage in intellect. And what stage? He calls it Hakara and Hargosha. That state when you come to recognize the idea, when you come to relate to it, identify with it. This is the word resonate, internalize. Hakara, you recognize. Hakara means, for example, in halacha, when you talk about, let's say, when Eidim come and they have to say Eidus, whether a husband is alive or not, they have to have Hakara. You have to recognize. You can't just say, how do you know maybe it wasn't him? Maybe you saw someone in passing. So Hakara is an actual state of recognition. There's also halachas about when you want to identify someone. Identification requires more than just a superficial or a look in passing. You need hakaras hadava, recognition. So the word nikr or hakara plays a big role in nigla in that sense. In seichel, hakara means a deep, an internal recognition. Hargasha, he calls hargasha pnimius, where you really feel it internally. So he uses the word hargasha, though it's not hargasha midas, but it's already hargasha in seichel. Now they both relate to each other. He clearly said that hakara leads to hargasha, but they're connected and they're generally used here. He uses in one context, but still it is two different terms. Now, he also said that these words, Daas so he's not connecting both elements. That when you have akara and hargasha in something, you really recognize it, you relate to it, identify with it, and internalize it, feel its truth. Then that leads to hiskashus and hiskabros. In the parentheses a little later, he says that alone needs hiskashus. In order to reach akara, he says zegam ide hiskashus. So I pointed that out yesterday. So bottom line would be chokhmah. Well, now he goes to bina. Bina is hasagas hadover. There you still can be distant. Meruchak, he said, from the idea that you're understanding to the point, and you don't feel it internally, to the point that bina is a form of makif, and even though it says, and that's why you're capable of understanding something that you don't even relate to, and even something that you dislike and despise. Dover hasani. Daas, however,
and that's why a child could be smart but not have that.
Let me finish one second. Let me finish the summary, just for the benefit of everybody, and then you can comment. So Daas, as a course of shemakir b'sichli shadoveru kach sha'ideizehu argosh shenirge she'in b'pnimis. So first, you recognize it's a recognition. It's like just to use an example. Let's say you're traveling and you see a crowd of people. Then you suddenly see your child, your son or your daughter in that crowd. So the first thing is akara. Of all the people, I recognize a person that I love. And that leads to hargosha, to a feeling of, obviously, I'm not going to say love because I don't want to go to midas, but it's hargosha primis. Not just you recognize that person, but you also have now a type of feeling in that recognition leads you to hargosha primis, is what he calls here. Okay. And then I'm summing up what we learned. Who havos v'amshachas ha'er, and through that, remember he said Das draws down and carries the energy from a higher level to another level, to a lower level. And then in the parentheses, he said that's why Geulas Mitzrayim, the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt, required ayoda, v'yeda Hashem, Elikim. Yedaiti es michmechevov. That like Rashi says, nosan aleim lev. That the idea means that an empathy, a relationship, a identifying with them. Not just being aware. Not just being aware that the Jews were in Egypt. Not just bina, understanding it, but actually relating and applying yourself, basically empathizing, relating, identifying. I mean, all these words are correct. Okay. And then the next thing we began learning, I'll start from there, but I'll stop here for a moment if anybody wants to comment or ask something. Go ahead.
Just a cotton is not Ben Daas, even if he's a very big chacham.
I said that yesterday. We spoke about it. Yeah, because he does not have his kashus and his chabrus, and doesn't have hakara and hargosha, correct? Yeah. A child prodigy could have chacham and bina, but das is either not there at all or weak. Correct. That's why there are many halachas where you need a bar das. It's not enough to a smart person. You need das, you need a bar das, yeah. Cheres sheiti v'kotten is considered, they don't have deya. Lav b'nei deya nir.
What's the hakora in Chachma?
What is what?
The hakora in Chachma.
He's not talking about Hakara and Chachma. He's talking about Hakara and Das.
I understand the Hakara of Chachma, which is.
Where do you see Hakara and Chachma here?
I'm not saying that. We have Das, which is Mechaber, Chachma and Bina. There's Hakara. It's easy to visualize the Hakara of that brings Bina into actuality. But what would be the Hakara in Chachma if it's doesn't have.
First of all, he uses bina primarily. He doesn't even use chachma. On the top of page 1176, he contrasts it with bina because chachma is not even chachma is a dat. There's a nakuda. Chachma is just a pure concept. You're just aware of something, like he's called it before yediyah. Yediyah v'asaga. Yediyah is awareness. So number one is a chachma, not necessarily that there's there's nothing to hold on to. Bina is where the Chachma is developed into a full comprehensible idea and still could be lacking the Hakara and Hargosha of Das. So I think here Chachma and Bina are used together. Bina as an extension of Chachma. He's not going into the detail of Chachma, the detail of Bina. The only thing he did say, the bottom of last page, is that it connects Chachma and Bina. So I explained them what that may mean as far as the integrity of the idea that Chachma connects with Bina and Bina with Chachma, that they're connected. But he's not. I don't see here any distinction between, or I wouldn't even go venture to try to distinguish between the Hakara as it relates to Chachma or the Hakara as it relates to Bina. I think here Chachma and Bina are one flow of consciousness, of awareness and understanding, and then within that you come to a point of Agosha Pnimius, Hakara and Agosha Pnimius.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to start from the line after the parentheses, the line that begins V'hu Hargosha Sadover. 3, 6, 9. 9 lines from the top of page 1176. If you want to follow the text, I explain the text. So even if you don't have it, I will read and explain it all. But if you want to follow it, go to ayinbeis.com. There you have PDFs of these pages. Okay. V'zeu gam ken inyan hadas ba'aveda. And this is also the inyan of Das and Aveda. What is it in Aveda? Right now he's talking about it more in the context of Seichel. But Naveda, he says, this is the Aveda, I'm sorry, She'akodesh v'argosha sa'era leki. So just like he said about a concept, that Bina, you don't yet have that recognition and that resonance and that sense of feeling that it relates to you. Agosha pnimius of the idea, that it's internalized and that to that extent. Same thing as an Aveda, the Eira Leki. You can have an Eira Leki, you can experience something godly, but not necessarily internalized. So the Iks of Adas and Aveda is the Hakara Hargosha Eira Leki by Dezeh Dafke. And explicitly and specifically through the Das, the Deya, the Hakara and Hargosha, who are Gili Benafshe. That's what causes the Gili. It should be revealed in his nefesh. He's going to speak about more of this, but just briefly, you can have an Avedus Hashem that's not fully internalized. You can do something and have Chachma and Bina in it, in other words, understand it, but it's not yet really fully one with you, and completely internalized in that sense. Like we discussed yesterday, Hargosha Pnimis in something is not just you're aware of it, it's not just you understand it, but you are one with it. You become connected to it, committed, devoted, attached, connected. All that is part of Das, the connection with it. So that's why you find many times someone can come to a Farbrengen or experience or learn Chassidus, and yes, they may have a full understanding of what's said, but someone says it relates. You say, no, I'm just a tourist. I'm passing through. I'm observing. I'm learning. I'm understanding. But am I in? Is this part of my life, and is it one with me? Not necessarily. So Das and Aveda is that Hargosha Pnimis, Hakara Hargosha Pnimis, that Hakara again, Huadas, Hakara Hargosha Sa'era Leki, which brings the Gili Benafshe. That's where we stopped yesterday, and I'll continue now. Ulechein, and therefore, Ikra Aveda Huadas. So the primary Aveda, now he's saying not just there is an Aveda of Das, primary Aveda Hashem, the main Aveda of a person is to reach this level. That's the primary Aveda Das. Ukamesha Kosov. He's going to now prove that by bringing a pasuk. Da and Salekei Avicha v'Avdeu b'Leiv Shalom. Know Elokei, your God, your Father, and serve Him with a complete heart. So the focus here is on the word Da. Da is Salekei Avicha. Says the Rebbe Rashab. The Masha Omer Da. When he says the word Da, no, Eina Kavone al Hayidiyah v'Hasaga. Going back to what he said at the bottom of last page. Da, most of us say, no, be aware, understand. In other words, a state of understanding and information, knowledge, understanding. So you say, no, Da does not mean that in this pasuk. He says, Ein hakavana al yediyah v'hasaga, on knowing and understanding. I know it's confusing a bit because yediyah sounds like Das, but clearly he's making the distinction that yediyah could also not be Das. Yediyah could be chachma. Yediyah means to know something. Doesn't mean that there is hiskashus and hischabrus or hakara and hargosha. Just for the record. And he's, how do we know it doesn't mean yediyah v'hasaga? Says, the ma mitzvah esay das, the ma mitzvah esay das alakei avicha, the hayatzarich lelamde. When you say to somebody, know your God, what does that mean? Why is it what kind of commandment is that? If it means understanding, you have to teach him. That's called chinuch. So what's the commandment da? That's how he's explaining it. I'm not sure what the question is completely. Why could you say da? And let's continue. Maybe we'll understand it in the flow.
That means that you have to know. How should you know? The command should be teach your son.
Right. Yeah. How should you know? Exactly. How could you command someone know if it's learning? So he continues. Bilti Sofiku, and there's no doubt at all. Bilti Sofik, undoubtedly, Shalomad Eiseh Yediyas Vasagas Alakus. And there's no doubt that yes, Lamad Eiseh, does he mean that God teaches us or that we teach each other? Al Kaponim, that a person is taught to know and to understand godliness. So that's not this pasuk. Coming. Now, when you say, for example, hold on, so it means educate your children. Or other verses that talk about chanech lanar al pidarke, or other verses that talk about the process of education. Da, saying no, to know you need to teach. So he's saying, so this verse is not talking, there's no question that the person is taught. So then what is the verse coming to add? What is Daas alikech? So he says, Rakakavone be'emre da es alikei avicha, that only the intention, therefore, is not to know and understand. That's established before you get to da. That's something that comes through education and you've been definitely taught. Now comes an additional verse and adds something. What does it add? It adds that it adds, this is the command, that not only should you know and understand, that you should have a recognition and a feeling for Elikus. That this Inyan Eliki, which you've already learned, Chachma and Bina is there already, you should have, it should be by him in a state of Harkara and Hargosha, that you relate and identify with it. Not just that you know it. So just a simple statement, simple way of Balabatish way of explaining this. When we begin teaching children in school, from the youngest age, you teach them about godliness, you teach them what God wants. You learn Chumash, you may learn some Chassidus, whatever it may be. At that stage, the child is not yet internalized it, they know. And there's not only Kabbalah sale, they also have an awareness. But Hakarav Argosha is a particular stage where you own the godliness in your life. There's a Tater from the Baal Shem Tov. He says, why do we say in Shemoneh Esrei, Elikenu, Elikei Avosenu, Elikei Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov? The order should be faket. The chronological order is that first God was the God of Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov. Then he's Elikei Avosenu, the God of our fathers, of our parents. And then Elikenu. You start, Hashem Elikenu, Elikei Avosenu, Elikei Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov. And he answers, because initially in life, you begin learning that the God of our fathers, you learn Chumash, you learn Avram Avinu, and Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the Eibishter appeared to them, and made promises, and made a covenant with them, Abris, Ben Absarim, and all that we learn. Still Elikei Avram Yitzchak Yankov. In this next stage, Elikei Avosenu, it's our parents that send us to school. It's our parents who teach us at home about what God is and what God wants of us. But the Kavanah says the Baal Shem Tov, it should be Elikeinu. You shouldn't just be serving the God of your parents and the God of Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov. That's the technical order as we grow. But what the Kavanah is, that's why it starts. Elikeinu. It's our God. It's our God. It means a God that I can relate to, that I own, and I'm responsible to, not just because I was told. Like a lot of children will say, even adults, if they're honest, some will say, the reason I serve God is because that's what my parents make them happy, or that's what they taught me. And you say, do you yourself relate to it? Some will say yes, some will say no. Chaz v'shalom, but that's the case. So Elikeinu means it's something you've come to determine and relate to. So in the beginning, it all starts with Chachma and Bina. You first have to learn about it. But then Daas Elokei Avicha is saying now that you know what it is, now make it yours. Akorav Argosha. Recognize as God, meaning something that you can relate to, that you identify with, and Hargosha Panimis. That's how he's explaining Da. And the reason, as he said, because Da, to tell someone no, what do you mean know God without learning? You have to first teach it. So therefore, that knowing is saying, once you learn it, the command is now internalize it in Hakorav Argosha. That's Daas Elokei Avicha. And of course, makes sense now, the continuing of the Pasuk, because then it will be Vavdeir, Belev Shalom. Because then you'll serve him with complete heart, because it's yours, it's your heart. You're not just doing it mitzvah sanoshim lemodam mechanically or robotically. It's become yours. It's become yours in Primius. Okay. Now he continues in the parentheses. V'zeh, which is that? This Hakorav Argosha, this state of identification, connection, I'm keep looking for the right word, but it's all the words above: recognition, resonance, feeling. This is not a state that comes through learning, from teaching and learning. Ulfana is Aramaic for teaching. Like an education, a teaching. So this is not in a state of, we're not talking about Ulfana v'limud. Ulfana v'limud, he said, was there before the Da. Because limud, meaning when you learn about something in a book, in a sefer, you start learning about Elokus and Chassidus. Says limud yochelias rak b'sogas hadover. Could be, or could also be only in understanding the idea. L'lamdei heitiv b'sogas Ayin. To learn it well in understanding what the subject matter is. You can have that completely without Hakara and Argosha. Let me read it again. How and what? In other words, you fully understand the subject matter, how it is and what it is. In other words, you have a full understanding. We're not talking about someone who doesn't have an understanding. Someone who doesn't have an understanding, you're not even the level of Chacham and Bina. So here we're talking about there is an understanding. And you're able to establish it in a very clear way. In other words, it's not superficial understanding. You have a very clear understanding of a whole subject matter. In Inyan, a person can be somebody who's like I don't want to say the word professor, but he's an academic and studies an Inyan and Torah, an Inyan about godliness, and knows it well. He knows the inside out. And Lamid al-Buriv means to establish it in a very clear and defined way. That's the ultimate limit. He says, through doing this, he could then come, but it's not guaranteed. You could have that stage and not yet have. But through this, he can come to a Inyan, to recognizing the Hakara, to, in other words, identifying with it and having a type of connection with it. And then he adds one more point. And through this
not so
Hakara,
clear here. Not so
what?
clear. it's not so clear. But you know
what? I didn't even read it yet. You're telling me it's not clear? I didn't read it and I didn't explain it. So let me finish reading and explaining it. And then we could see what's clear, what's not clear, if you don't mind. Okay? So he says, and through this clarity of understanding something, you can come to recognizing it. And through the recognition, I think what he's saying here, that the recognition, when you recognize an idea, in other words, you identify with it, it also, you learn from that how to understand something better. In other words, Hakara is a state, does add and increase in understanding something, because you can understand it in a way that's not, as I said, internalized, but it does lead you to Hakara. And then he says, through this you learn how to understand an inexpressible. What he's saying with that is that even though Bina or Hasaga, comprehension is not Hakara on its own, but Hakara does increase in the Bina of something. It's not a completely separate entity. In other words, you could have Hasaga without Hakara, but Hakara helps you also have how to be Masig and Inyan better. I could explain that based on what I said yesterday, that when you learn something that has no connection to you, like, we talked before about learning something that you actually despise, for whatever reason. Let's say you're an academic, or you're a lawyer, or a doctor, or a judge, and you need to learn about something that you don't identify with, but you need to know it for your practice or whatever it may be. But it's not something that resonates with you. So that is a level of understanding. But when you do have Hakara in it, it will help you understand better. Because when you relate to it, I remember when we listened to the Rebbe, and because we already knew and had a deeper connection to the ideas and wanted to have that connection, it definitely helps you understand it better. That's what I believe he's saying here in this parentheses, just as to complete the picture. But the main point that he wants to bring out outside the parentheses, this is a parenthesis within the parentheses. Okay. But the etzamin of Hakara, what he said earlier, there you can't teach someone to identify with something. You can teach them information. You can be a great teacher and teach data. You can have a good understanding of it. But for them to have that Hakara, that type of resonating identification and relationship and recognition, you can't teach someone that. That's something that comes through a particular avodah, where you go deeper into it. Now, obviously, a teacher can try to do that by example or by inspiration, by stories. I mentioned the nigun. But the actual education itself, the teaching of an idea, that's in one category. So what he's saying in this parenthesis basically is elaborating a bit on the point he made earlier. He said that Da is not about knowing and understanding, because that needs to come through the lamde, to teach someone that. Da comes afterwards. After you've learned, now is the commandment, connect to it, recognize it, hargoshev, internalize it. So he's saying here that Hakara and Hargosha, it does not come through Ofen of Limud. That does not come through education. Because you can learn something. I'm just going over the parentheses again. Right? Limud does not guarantee that you're going to come to Hakara. Afterwards, you could come to Hakara Se'inyan. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean you can't come to it, but it doesn't necessitate it. You could have a comprehension of an idea completely and not have Hakara. Then you can come to it. And then he says, when you do, it helps Nilmad Echla Hasik Inyan Sechli. It helps understand how to understand an Inyan, because you relate to it. But bottom line is, Hakara itself, in that, is not a matter of limud. It's a matter of avodah, that a person applies themselves to fulfill the Daas Alikei Avicha and connect with the idea and come to recognize it, come to identify with it.
Rabbi Jacobson?
That's how that's the parentheses, yeah.
Is this talking, it seems like the Hakara, it's an intellectual Hakara that doesn't lead to Hergish at all?
Where do you see that?
I'm just wondering, because he studies it, he understands it thoroughly, he has a hecker, but he doesn't mention in the parentheses Hakosha. That's what I'm wondering.
No, that's not what he's saying. No. He's saying that you can understand something and not necessarily have a recognition, but by studying it, you could come to a recognition, and that hakara, in turn, also helps the understanding. That's all he's saying. He's not precluding anything here. Remember, you could have that it comes from hakara. He's not going into the detail. What he wants to focus on here is that the reason he's using hakara because hakara relates more to seichel than hargosha in a way, but I don't think he's excluding anything here.
All right. Okay. Good.
Because before the parentheses, he says hakara v'hargosha. Both of them are not really in the category of being taught. I don't think he's precluding anything here.
That's a step that the behalf of Korah in an Indian, after you learn it thoroughly, is a pretty standard notion in the process of learning. You know, you want to achieve that so that when the situation comes up, when you learn Indian Shulchan Aruch, when it comes up, you'll know what you see. You know, but not necessarily that you're expected to have a hargasha. This is
that's complete speculation. I don't see anywhere in this mimer that that's hinted to at all. To me, a kor of hargasha das. There's two stages you could say, but he doesn't. I don't see anywhere here that he's trying to suggest they have a kor without hargasha. You know, obviously it's stages. You could come to no hakara at all. You can come to hakara without hargasha. You can come to hakara and hargasha, and further. But he's not going into that here. There's no. He's not going into these different options. He's basically stating what he wants to state. That the ikar avodah is da yediyah. That's the avodah of coming to a state of hakara and hargasha. The parenthesis just qualifies how much of it is connected to learning and how much is connected to another aspect. You could say what I was going to say, but that's not relevant necessarily to the hargasha part. I mean, again, what you're saying may be true, but he doesn't say that here. That what you could say is the following: that through bina, after an understanding and clear understanding, he says, you can come to hakara Ayin, which I would understand that to mean das. You could argue that he means that you don't come to a full hakara like in das. You come through the cloud, but I don't think why would we say that? You know, das does follow bina. From bina, you're expected to go to das. So since he doesn't qualify it, I mean, technically you could break it into a hakara that comes out of bina. You could talk about hakara, full-blown hakara that comes into das. But then you'd have to be forced to explain what's the difference between the two. So I would rather not go there and just say hakara sein is possible, and through that you come to more understanding. Aval etzemi and hakara is not a shaykh to limud. That's the main thing that he wants to say at the end of the parentheses.
Hakara is not shaykh to bina. The hakara, the emes, is shaykh to das.
The word emes, he's not using the word emes here, so I wouldn't use that word. But hakara, he says, is not something you're taught, even though from bina you could come to hakara, which is, frankly, that's the way it's supposed to work.
If you have
bina,
das,
then you come to das hakara. That's so. It's always that you don't skip chachma and bina. You know, I mean, you could ask a question: can someone have das and not have chachma and bina? It's an interesting question. I would probably argue not in seichel, because you need to have the seichel has to go through that steps. You could say a person could have a hergish, they hear a nigan, and they have a hergish and elikus, but is that das? That's a good question. I think here das
they have the hergish, but they don't really have the hakara.
Remember that the word das is using here. If you remember the bottom of the previous page, he spoke about das as being a moyach shlishi. That's not just iskashus and ischabrus. He said das is a moyach shlishi. The korav argosh is a inyan sichli. He did not say a korav argosh is outside of the realm of seichel. It's moyach chachma bina das. So I would say, without even hesitating, that we're talking here hakara as a continuation to the next step. That's what das alekei avicha is. After you have bina, come to yediyah, hakara and hargasha. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think splitting hairs here is just going to complicate matters for no reason.
You do say Shosak Rav. He didn't have an explanation. He knew it was true. He's paskin halacha like that.
Who says that? He's talking about Shosak Rav here. He doesn't mention it, and maybe a completely different level.
It sounds like Das without Bina, directly from.
I don't have any evidence to say that.
Shosak Rav he had the.
So hold on. Let me answer one thing at a time. Shasik Rav is not mentioned here at all. It's not hinted to. For all you know, it's not this level at all. If you tell me you find a mimer that Shasik Rav is the level of Das, Hakorev Hargosha, without Chochma Bina, we can discuss it. But as far as my knowledge is, Shasik Rav is not related to here at all.
It's not without Chochma Bina. But Rav, there was Chochma Bina.
So everybody's talking. Two people are talking at once. Let Yecheskel finish, and then we'll talk. What do you say, Yecheskel? What?
We spoke yesterday. We defined the haknacha of Chachma as being fairly distant from the person, doesn't have the impact that Das has. So it's just what I was thinking in that direction. If it's really going to be
but even that was also speculation because he doesn't talk about that either here. That was my answering your question. You asked me, what about when we learn about Hanocha Sichlis? I answered that question. But what them now we're doing is going a layer upon a layer. Both of them are not discussed here.
Okay.
So listen, I'm trying to be careful. If you want to look up other Maimorim about Shasik Rav and you want to feel that it connects, I'll be happy to look at it. But to talk from Baal Peh, it's not, it's just confusing. It's to me, it doesn't let us understand what we're saying here. Okay, who else wants to comment?
I think that the Hanocha Sichlis and Shasik Rav, all of them are after you have Chochma Bina. But by Rav, the Chochma Bina was bepshitis. It was not some Shasik Rav. He knew the Chochma Bina, but the Daas, his Daas, was based on the Chochma Bina. His Daas said what it said. That's what I think. There's no such thing. There's no such thing Daas without Chochma Bina.
Well, listen, as I said, if someone can find a mimer that indicates otherwise, we can look at it. But right now, it's not relevant here because he definitely does not say that here anywhere. Here it's anyway. Anybody else want to comment on anything or ask anything?
I just one thing. I missed something. What's the translation of Ulfana?
Teaching.
Okay. And just something I wanted to ask for a while. You have that I don't know. This is the same Pile Mischakem or Misvainen or Mischased. Two. In a sort of in a shame pile. Is there a shame pile for Das?
I don't know.
You have Das, you have Yodeya.
Leda.
Yodeya, Yoda. The atom is Da.
It's interesting. The Rambam starts. You say there. You say Leda sheyesha motzadishin. He uses the word Leda. Okay, let's continue.
The same.
What the question is, we're talking about that. This has to belong to you. It still uses the Russian Das of Vicho. Why is it Vicho? It should be Das Elekecho.
You have to look another Maimorim. I don't know.
It seems to me that all those Lashonos are like in past tense.
I'm not sure. Is it relevant to this Maimer or we're talking Digduk here now?
I mean, I guess the point is that I guess Das is something that you don't do. It's something that comes from its binarness.
So that's you do. Da, you should know.
Da is an action. Da is a command to do. To da, no.
It's a result. It's a result of his binarness.
Da means to know. I'm not sure what you're saying. It's a statement no. Okay, let's continue on. Okay, so I'm continuing after the parentheses. So we established that Da is Hakorev Argosha. It's not about knowing and understanding. It's about internalizing, recognizing, feeling, and so on. Va'idei zeh dafka, and dafka through this, hu gili ha'er eliki b'nafshe. And it's dafka when you have the Da, the idea, The Akara and Agosha, that's when you have the Gili Alaki Benafshe. Remember, you used the word before that the Aveda is, in the beginning, he said, Akaras v'Agosha she'er Alaki Zedafku Agili Benafshe. Because when you learn about it, it's detached from you. Like he said with Bina, Meruchak. You can learn about something that has nothing to do with you. You can understand it very well. You can be a genius and an expert, but if it doesn't relate to you. Remember we spoke about the person who reads the letter. It doesn't affect him what it says in the letter because it's not about him. The person who's illiterate and hearing the letter, it affects him because it's about me. It's like by Fabrengens, you say, the ganze Sache is am nicht negehe. Meaning you know it, he understands it, the Rebbe would use, lei poga v'lei noga. But it doesn't impact you. The Rebbe would use very often from the Kutei Teir in Shmini, he says the word noga, negiya, rirtem on. It touches him. It moves him. You could hear something and it doesn't touch you, it doesn't move you, it doesn't impact you. So when he's saying here, that's why Daas is the Ikar Aveda. Why is it the Ikar Aveda? Because it's not just about knowing about it or learning about it. It's about being it, feeling it, saying it means me, memein dir. Like he says here. That the Aveda should be an Aveda Amitis. So in other words, without Daas, it's Aveda perhaps, but you can't call it true Aveda. True Aveda means that it really impacted you. And it's not genart, you're not fooling yourself, it's not superficial, it has pierced you. That's another good word. It's pierced your being, reached inside of you. I remember Mashpia telling me, he came from the Litvische world before he came to Chabad. I can tell you who it is, Melech Tzvibel. And he was in the Kfar Chabad, he was learning about Rab Shlomo Chaim Kesselman, the great Mashpia, the famous Mashpia. And he said he would always needle him that you learn it very academically, but it's not permeating. So he told me that his Mashpia was right. It wasn't permeating him. It was more of an intellectual exercise. He was a Lamdan. He was very curious, and he liked to master subjects. You know, you master a subject. He wanted to master Chassidus too. So I asked him, when did it finally permeate? I assumed it did because he changed his life. So he told me when he heard the nigun from the Rebbe, Anim Zmiris, in Tavshir Chav Beis, Simchas Torah. So he came with the kfutza, the first kfutza that came from Israel to America, to New York. He said when they heard Anim Zmiris, when the Rebbe sang Anim Zmiris, he says that's when it penetrated. That's when it pierced. So everybody has a stage where you can learn something, and you could even be impressed by it. It doesn't say here you're not, doesn't affect you, but Hakara, Agosh, Aveda Pnimis, Aveda, what he calls the Hergish Benafshe, Aveda Amitis is when it really pierces and penetrates. Obviously, there are many levels in Daas too. You could have a temporary piercing, penetration. You could have something more internal, more eternal, more perpetual. So that's what he says here. Okay. Ukamoi, and he's going to explain this with an example. Kamoi b'yeseiris ava v'yira b'lev. Like when we discuss the stimulation or the awakening or arousal of love and awe in the heart. He's moving now to the lev. We're not talking about das now, per se. Hine al-idei hasogav izbonus levad, through comprehension and contemplation alone, lo yiu ava v'yira amitis. A person will not, it won't bring to true love and awe of God. Ki im al-idei hadas dafke. So now he's explaining how das is the mamutza. So if you have Chochmah and Bina alone, or what he calls here hasoge v'izbonus, it's really Bina. It not necessarily lo yiu. They will not bring to true ava v'yira. Doesn't mean it can't bring to any feeling. He's not suggesting at all, but ava yira amitis. It's only through Das. So it's not example, actually. He's actually explaining the role of Das. It is Das that creates that you connect with the idea. Without that, you don't have a bridge to Midas. Because how are you going to feel love, direct personal love for Elikei Avicha, of Dur Belev Shalom, if you don't identify with it? If it remains an abstract idea I mentioned with Bertrand Russell. Let's say you're learning an idea, you're learning mathematics. You love it, it's beautiful, it may even make you feel something, but you don't have no devotion to it, you're not connected to it, you don't have Akara and Hargosha Pnimius. So obviously you're not going to lead to Ava V'yira. There's no Ava V'yira there. To have Ava V'yira, you need to have identified. It can't be an abstract idea that's detached from you. In other words, you can't skip from Chochmah to Bina to Midas. We're not talking about Midas Tivim now. We're not talking about natural, that a Jew has natural love. We're talking about Midas that are awakened and stimulated by idea, by contemplation. So Hasog and his bonus needs Das to attach it and connect it to a stimulated emotion. That you should actually feel, I'm drawn, I love this thing called godliness.
It's fascinating. He's saying his bonus, that even his bonus, without Das, you're not reaching it.
Yeah. And now he's bringing the Tanya. So in Tanya, the end of chapter 3, what does he say? After he speaks about Chochmah and Bina, he says, that after you conceive of that, what?
That's what he's saying. Yeah,
that's what I'm going to say. So what does it mean? That after you have the concept in Chochmah, the comprehension in Bina, then comes Shemakasher Daite, he attaches, Makasher. In other words, he concentrates and attaches himself, Bekesher Omitz V'chozak, with a powerful and strong bond. He doesn't just say Makasher Daite. He makes it very clear, Omitz V'chozak. So like if you look in the Tanya.
How do you do that?
Before we talk about how, let's talk about what, and then we'll discuss how. First, let's establish what he says, then we'll talk about how. So, a deep connection and bond, Keshem is v'chazik, and then he continues, Ki af mi shu chochem v'novim, because even a person who's a chochem is wise, v'novim, bina, b'gedulas ein seif baruch hu. He's wise and understanding and discerning and understanding in the greatness of Ein Sof Baruch Hu. If he does not bond his mind, his das to it, lo yelid benafshei yira va'ava amitis. In his nefesh will not give birth. It will not produce in his nefesh an awe, yira, and ava. Amitis, true yira and ava, because the idea
like Aristotle.
One second. Let me just finish the point here, and then we'll just let me read. I will pause for your comments. I just want to finish the sentence because we're all learning together. Just want to keep focused here. So let's say. So he says like this: Lo yikasha daita lo yele benafshi yira va'ava amitis ki'im dimyenes shav. So without Das, without that connection, the idea is it's still detached from you. So it won't give birth to a true awe and love. Only Dimyena Shav, basically illusions, wasted illusions. No, it's illusions that you may feel something, but it's going to be very superficial. I'll explain Dimyena Shav in a minute, but I just want to finish and this is all from Tanya, by the way. Valkein Hadas Ukiyam Amidus. Now he adds one more point. And that's why Das, because Das bound you to this. You're now connected with it. So it gives birth to true Ava V'yira, or Yira V'ava. And that's why Das is Kiyum Amidus. It means it sustains. It is Kiyum Amidus, that the Midas should be sustained, not just fleeting. That's also Dimyena Shav. It could be fleeting. We all can have an inspiration through Chachma and Bina, and that inspiration should last for a little while, but it will dissipate. It won't remain. It won't be permanent. And Daas is that iskashus that creates permanence in the feelings that develops and produces.
It's changing you.
What?
It's changing you.
Yeah, exactly. It changes you. So in simple English, let's not go very deep. In simple English, it means this happens all the time. We can be very knowledgeable and very aware and very understanding of things, but it's not become one with you. It's an idea. It's a beautiful idea. It could be something that you find and even appreciate. He doesn't say you don't appreciate it, but it's not become one with you. There's a disconnect somewhere. Das creates that oneness, that idea is now mine. It's my personal relationship with it. That in turn will create true midas of ava v'yira toward it, and not something fleeting or something illusion or like comes and goes, something permanent, kima midas, sustainable, and so on. So das is a major avodah, is a major part of avodah. It's what internalizes godliness in our lives. Whereas chachma and bina are necessary because that's where the comprehension is. But the hiskashus element, which comes from the hakara and hargosha, is the contribution and the uniqueness of das. That's essentially what he just said. Now, I think you just have to look in your own heart, in your own life, and find examples for this. You know, I would challenge you. Look at something you understand well, but has not become one with you, and something that has become one with you. It's as simple as that. Now, if you say nothing has become one with you, we'll discuss that later. But that would be the distinction between these two, between with das or without das. And again, you could have many things without das. But he calls it ultimately, it's fleeting, it's dimyena shel shov, dimyena shel shov, dimyena shov rather, and so on. Okay, does anybody want to ask anything?
In physical things, you have no problem to understand what das is. When you have a taiva, you don't have to change yourself. You have the hakora ve'argosha. That's why it's right away turns you on. In spiritual thing, that you know about it, but in order to become you have to connect yourself to this idea. That's what the das is. In physical things, you have the das in a natural way.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the Gemara says, we know, ein kishay el das. For a person to have a sexual stimulation, you need das. It's not just you read about it in a book. It becomes something that touches you. So correct in that sense. And many other things. That's in L'umazah. Or not L'umazah, I mean, it could also be in Kedusha. But yes, das is not just understanding or knowing something. It's when it becomes, you relate to it and it's affecting you directly.
And the way is kesher amitz v'chazak.
Yeah.
This kesher amik v'chazak, it sounds like repetitive and deeper understanding in what it means to you.
Not understanding.
Please. It sounds like you're going deeper and deeper to how it's meaningful to you, whatever term you want to use.
You are in a palace of a king, but not only that, you are really putting yourself, you're imagining, you're making it a life feeling. You are not thinking about other things, just you feel, you are putting your mind completely, you're surrounded in these things that it's touching your feelings. That's a kesher amitz v'chazak. Number one, you have to know about the Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Then you have to imagine how great it is, how wonderful it is, what kind of a pleasure that the physical pleasures. As small that you making it real in life, this is the kesher amitz v'chazak.
Not necessarily. This I disagree with what you just said. What you just said, in my understanding, that's still bina. to understand the greatness of it and how beautiful it is, that could be detached also. That's a nice concept. People do that all the time. I think what Daas is more than that. It makes it yours. It has to be beautiful to you, not just beautiful in concept.
It integrates.
It's beautiful to
everything.
you.
Right, beautiful to you. Right, beautiful to you.
It integrates everything, and that's how you can be. When you're an integrated person, you live your Yiddishkeit. It's part of you. And I mentioned before Aristotle. He was a brilliant guy, but he had no das. He was able to do horrible things. And all of us could do somewhat horrible things. I mean, if we don't have that integration and the das, it's really what Meichen of Amidus means.
Right.
He
But,
had Das. Aristotle
Jacobson,
had
Rabbi
Das.
Jacobson, I still want to know what it means, chazak v'amitz.
So I would suggest you look in Tanya and the Rebbe's commentaries on Tanya and other commentaries. They talk about the two levels of chazak and amitz.
Oh, yeah?
It's
Okay. No,
Tanya. The Rebbe Rashab is just quoting Tanya. Let me just say
I
this.
know. I've read Tanya with Rabbi Weinberg, but you know,
There's commentaries with the Rebbe's commentaries. I believe, if I recall correctly, they speak about chazak v'amitz there.
I still
Look at
think
Tanya.
that the chazak ve'amitz is in the way that they said.
Where we find it safer? Is it
Tanya,
online?
I would look at Tanya Mevu'eres.
Okay.
Okay, you know what? Before we can comment there, we're going to stop here 2/3 of the way down on page